Greetings, loyal listeners. You are now listening to an encore presentation of a B30 mini talk session. So please stand by as the previously recorded podcast will begin shortly. Thank you once again for choosing B30 for your listening pleasure.
This session is about to get personal because I'm trying to figure out whether mental illness is a medical condition or actually a spiritual matter. So it's rather ironic that I have a BA in psychology, but when it comes to mental health awareness, I'm a little new, still kind of gray to me. Because when I think of mental illness, it's kind of like a giant umbrella term. It's like this huge category where all sorts of conditions ranging from depression, schizophrenia, anxiety, OCD. I'm not sure if even autism falls under that as well. And I don't know, it just gets more complicated. Like, what about psychosis and phobias and people with homicidal tendencies who are sociopathic or psychopathy? Like, I don't know. But for the sake of simplicity, when I refer to mental illness in this particular discussion, I'm only going to refer to only a particular dimension, which I like to call the psychological triad, which is stress, anxiety, and depression. To be honest, I don't know much about it, and when I try to explain it or define them, I face the same difficulty as trying to explain something like the Holy Trinity. Those three things are all different and distinct on their own, but at the same time, you can't discuss stress, anxiety, and depression in isolation from each other. For example, there's some external circumstance in your life that causes you to worry and it makes you nervous. So we will label that external circumstance or source like a stressor, a source of stress. And when that becomes a regular occurrence, kind of becomes a significant part of your thoughts and just occupies your mind a lot, then it becomes internalized. It becomes this internally generated thoughts and feelings of worry and panic. And when it becomes internal, it causes you to worry and panic. We call that anxiety. So I think just figuring out what's the difference between stress and anxiety already gave me kind of make my brain cry. But what I get from it is stress is something caused externally, whereas anxiety is something internally driven and caused, which makes you nervous. Another thing about anxiety is there's this concept of self-rumination where you're constantly thinking about the same thought over and over, that same thing that worries you. When the stress makes you nervous and then you start thinking about it again and again and then you start to worry, the stress then grows into and blossoms into this nasty thing called anxiety. And when you let anxiety grow over time, it becomes that dreaded D word, depression, consistent emotional state, like a long-term mood of doom and gloom, like you're physically tired, things don't taste as good as they used to, so you kind of lose your appetite. There's a lack of drive to do anything. Most of the things in your life that were fun or made you happy just weren't doing it anymore. Just mope around and you're in this kind of rut. So stress, anxiety, depression. I mean, I can go all day trying to list all the symptoms of depression, but I just want to show you that you can't really talk about depression without thinking about anxiety and stress. It's hard to talk about them in isolation with each other. So for example, if you experience stress, it can grow and lead to anxiety or worst case scenario like depression. And say if you suffer from anxiety, they try to trace the source of your anxiety, and sometimes it's usually an external source, which we call stress. And if you leave it untreated or if you don't address the problem, it grows, and depression is your potential outcome. So again, those three things are all distinct, have their own definitions, but you can't talk about them in isolation from each other. Now, I just want to throw out a little disclaimer here. I apologize if I overgeneralize and I'm ignorant about this topic I'm talking about, because every person's struggle and circumstance is different. So this supposed interrelationship between these three conditions aren't necessarily true for everyone. But what ignited this detour of me trying to establish a operational definition for mental illness is, this all came about because some very tragic and disturbing news I read over the summer. This pastor and well-known best-selling author guy called Rick Warren, his first child, Matthew, committed suicide. He bought a gun. I think he pretty much just shot himself in the head. Stating the obvious, This is sad and heartbreaking news when a parent outlives their child. But at the same time, I'm not trying to be mean-spirited or trying to mock Pastor Rick Warren here, but it just makes you question your preconceived notion that Christians are immune to mental illness. I get this image or this impression that, oh, God is supposed to fill your hearts with love and joy and peace, and that it can overcome any hardship that goes your way. But for some reason, Matthew Warren, probably living in a very emotionally, spiritually, and physically healthy household, was still susceptible to like a mental illness. And what I find very shocking is you got a guy like Rick Warren who's influenced many. I think he was the guy who wrote Purpose-Driven Life or something. I really, like, that book just caught on fire, kind of went viral in a sense. And, a lot of churches started reading that book. And it was really insightful and it's really encouraging stuff. So indirectly, people kind of look at him as like a spiritual guru. But don't you find it rather ironic that this guru who was able to help all these people, he was so powerless to help his very own son, that his son eventually shot himself in the head. I don't want to kick Pastor Warren when he's down and throw sand in his face and kind of poke fun at his misfortune, but I just want to point out the strong grip of death that anxiety and depression has over humanity. It ultimately comes down to a person afflicted with anxiety or depression or mental illness is already hard enough battle. But I think Christians who are indeed susceptible to mental illness or struggling with mental illness in secret out of fear of being looked down on or out of shame, they have a tougher battle. It's kind of a worse upon worse situation. Now, I can attest to this because I have some personal experience when it comes to dealing with mental illness. I myself showed some symptoms of what doctors called generalized anxiety or panic disorders. Basically, you get panic attacks, you have these nervous breakdowns, and you just like fall apart. And I remember the first time being officially diagnosed by a doctor. And on my way home from a commute, you have this, man, I thought I knew myself kind of moment where you have like a million thoughts racing through your head. Because I was under the impression, if you're a devout Christian, given that you're spiritually healthy, never in a million years would I have thought that I, or Christians in general, suffer from a mental disorder. So then, therefore, my train of logical thought was, if I'm susceptible to a mental illness, that means I must have been a bad Christian. I don't have the Holy Spirit indwelling within me, and that's why I was susceptible to a mental illness. And another thing I felt was, you know what, I'm a wuss. And you just feel like a bag of crap. Because I always thought that mental illness was just a first world nation phenomena that's cooked up for people who have phobias, who are emotionally and psychologically weak. I thought people who have mental illness, they're basically people who can't hack it in real life. So they break down and they fall apart. And to say, for lack of a better word and for my ignorance, I thought those people were just, pathetic. I used to think, those people just need to suck it up, persevere in life, have an extra drink, sleep it off, and get at it. So when I myself was exhibiting symptoms of anxiety and panic attacks, it was by far one of the most humbling and embarrassing experiences of my life. To add insult to injury, I was then put on medication, an antidepressant and some muscle relaxants to help alleviate symptoms. So I thought to myself, man, this is the worst situation ever, because what if a non-Christian all of a sudden just walks through the door and sees my mental disorder or affliction? They're probably thinking, I thought you were a Christian, but you have to take pills like the rest of us real world people. It's kind of like the Simpsons episode where Chief Wiggum goes, "Where's your Messiah now, Flanders?" It just crushes your self-confidence and self-esteem, and it just makes you question whether you're a good Christian or not, because here you are taking pills just like any non-believer. What makes my faith so special? So I went through this inward spiral where I was thinking about that stuff. So I felt that shame for a long time. Luckily for me, I came across this article by Fred Espy, and he's this writer who actually was going through the same struggle as me. He was taking antidepressants as well. And in his article, he offered some really great advice. ultimately gave me some perspective on my own situation. One tip he said, for those who are taking medication, it's easy to think of it as a lack of faith or patience that God can't or won't heal you. But why don't you just reframe the situation and see it as a temporary attempt to manage symptoms while you wait for God? When you have to take pills like everybody else and you're a Christian, don't see it as a sign of failure. It's basically an attempt or something to buy you time to manage symptoms while you wait for God to do the actual healing and fixing. Now, I'm going to be honest, when I first read it, that's just some BS, sugar-coated excuse of saying it's okay to pop pills and not feel guilty about it. But believe it or not, there is some biblical precedence. Perhaps there is some biblical precedence that contains a timeless application that supports SB's idea that medicating under a health professional is okay for a Christian. What precedence am I talking about? I am referring to 1 Timothy chapter 5. Verse 23. The context here is in this letter, 1 Timothy, Paul's doing his missionary journey thing, traveling the world, and before he goes on this huge tour, he instructs Timothy to care for the church. When he finds out that he might not ever return to the church, the Ephesus church, he sent Timothy a letter to basically iron out the details of how to take care of the Ephesus church. So you got things like supervising church affairs, finding qualified leaders, false teaching. It was a real tumultuous time. It's a instructional letter. So you get to chapter 5 and Paul's outlining some tips on how to appoint elders in a church. Out of nowhere, kind of drops a quick bit of advice for Timothy, and he says, stop drinking only water and use a little wine for the sake of your stomach and your frequent illnesses. Basically, Paul is saying, dude, you need to take care of yourself. You have stomach problems. Now, the use of the words are kind of vague and open interpretation. So what do you mean by use a little wine for the sake of your stomach and quote-unquote frequent illnesses? So the word frequent in the Greek, it's up to your interpretation. You can think of it as a thick or dense or a very serious illness. But let me be clear, this Bible passage or verse does not explicitly state that you can take pills for mental illness. In fact, I think it's just Paul trying to point out that drinking water situation back in the time was less than ideal, so don't be afraid to wine drink. I think that was probably the advice. But perhaps there is a timeless teaching in this verse that we can apply in our own specific situation. SB's claim that we have an example here where you can manage your symptoms. Timothy had stomach problems and other illnesses, and he used wine to manage symptoms. With that train of logical thought, is it that far-fetched that we can use pills and antidepressants to kind of manage our own symptoms in this modern-day world context? Just throwing it out there. But ultimately, of course, it's God who is in charge of determining your health. So, say you're committed to the medication, you're ready to address the situation, you're on the road to recovery, and then you begin to realize that, this whole mental illness thing, it's really embarrassing, it's humiliating. But when you think about it, it's kind of what SB calls an invitation to humility. What he means by that is it's humiliating as a religious person to take psychiatric medication, because what you're basically doing is you're admitting you're sick and that you need worldly help instead of some spiritual healing. And let me tell you, from my own personal experience, when I was at Student Health Services, you're filling out questionnaires and evaluation forms, you're told to list your symptoms, and then you're listing your personal information, your background. I just felt like crap when I wrote down on the piece of paper that I went to a Christian grad school. It just made me think the irony. I'm supposed to be this leader, a place where leaders are being developed. I guess I'm supposed to be ideally this spiritually in tune person. But here I am, helpless and powerless in a medical setting, about to get the okay and approved of taking pills. I just felt like any other non-believer lost soul. In a sense, I felt I discredited Christianity. When you have to humiliate yourself and write down your symptoms on a medical form, I felt like the medical form was like this big billboard, just flashing neon lights saying, look at this religious guy, his God can't or won't heal him. But however, SB's article continues and comments on that, and how people who experience mental illness often come to a realization that sometimes there may be some pride issues one may need to deal with. If you've experienced stress and anxiety and depression, then it makes you kind of want to think and reflect on your life. It makes you dig deep and get real and try to find the root cause of what is your stress, what is your worry. Just something that people in North American culture would never believe is true is that maybe I was trying to do too much. Maybe I was being prideful that I can do this and do that and manage the time and fit in time for this and fit in time to do all this. And maybe stress, anxiety, and depression was a byproduct of my poor choices, of being prideful, thinking I could juggle all these things in my life at once. And the thing is, God has used physical afflictions in the past to keep our pride in check and develop humility. And one case I can think of is in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7, letter to the city of Corinth or the Corinthian church. False teachers were challenging Paul's authority. Some of them were accusing Paul of skimming off the top when it came to raising money for the famine fund for Jerusalem. So Paul was in a very defensive mode when he wrote the Corinthian letter. He was basically stating his upbringing, his credentials, his testimony, trying to establish that he's an honorable person. And what's funny is when you get to chapter 12 in 2 Corinthians, he's writing and he catches himself from dangerously crossing over. When you're establishing your authority, it's really easy to start boasting, particularly his boasting about his suffering for the gospel. That's why in 2 Corinthians 12:7, he writes, "In order to keep me from being conceited or arrogant, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan, to torment," or depending on how you interpret the Greek verb, you can say, "I was given this thorn in my flesh to harass me." But the point here is, this really educated and influential writer during this New Testament era had a undisclosed affliction. And there's not much detail into what it is, but the point is, it taught him humility and it kept his pride in check. So, what was the point of my rant here? I guess I just want to bring into the open this false relation where when you're showing signs of mental illness, you're not a very good Christian. That's why you're susceptible to mental illness. And I just think it's time to reevaluate these kind of preconceived notions. If you do happen to be struggling with a mental illness, or you're not sure whether you are or you do, your gut reaction is to ask, why me? But you know what? Why don't you try reframing your mindset? Use it as a chance to learn humility. Use it as a chance to reflect whether you have some prideful thoughts going around in your head and your heart. And more importantly, it's okay to not always be the person who has it all together. You can use mental struggle as a learning opportunity for people to realize that mental illness is indeed an actual illness. Okay, I think I've rambled long enough. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.